Terrifying Ways to Go, Episode 14, Alan Catterall. The Gates of No Return. So back in December of 2010, the then 54-year-old Alan had been working at the Piranha Kayak molding facility located in Runcorn, England. Now essentially the way this works is there are two molds for every one kayak, a top and a bottom. And while the first part of this process involves adding a powder known as linear polyethylene to said bottom mold, the upper mold is then placed on top, where even more powder is dumped inside through a small hatch. Now it's at this point a button is pressed, thus drawing the mold inside of this giant rectangular oven you're seeing right here. Well, shortly before 9 a.m. on December 23rd, an employee had just finished the process of powdering up a mold. However, upon activating this oven, the system returned an error code essentially stating the unit had to be cleaned prior to further production. The individual in question then notifies Alan just prior to using the bathroom, but upon his return, the code had been cleared out, all leading up to the critical moment he activated that oven while Alan was still inside performing maintenance. The doors would then close automatically as temperatures inside reached well over 500 degrees in just a matter of minutes, effectively sealing his fate in the process. And the thing is, no one even noticed anything was off until they saw smoke billowing out of the top of this thing. The process was then halted, and upon opening that oven, the discovery they made was absolutely horrifying. Alan had unfortunately spent his last few moments beating and prying on that door with a crowbar in a desperate attempt to escape. Further investigation would find Piranha Moldings, the company at fault, had not been enforcing lockout-tagout procedures at the time, which, for those of you who don't know, essentially means that oven should have been incapable of being turned on while somebody was inside. Piranha Moldings would incur about $200,000 in fines as a result. In addition to this, an escape hatch was made to be placed on each and every one of those ovens. But here's the real kicker. The individual who pressed that button was due to marry Alan's daughter in the near future, making this incident one of the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 15, K-141, The Depths of No Return. So back in August of 2000, a Russian nuclear-powered sub known as the K-141 Kursk had been performing a training exercise in the Barents Sea, which, for those of you who don't know, is located within the Arctic Circle. Well, at some point during this training, they load a dummy torpedo, and it was at this time a highly volatile substance known as high-test peroxide began leaking from a faulty weld on said warhead, when all of a sudden, an explosion rings out throughout the sub as they begin taking on a substantial amount of water due to the fact the inner and outer doors of the torpedo tube have been completely blown apart. In addition to this, the initial explosion would claim the lives of everyone in the control room as well as the torpedo room itself. And while yes, this in and of itself is a major issue, they have yet another problem. A flash fire is now rapidly consuming the remaining compartments of the vessel, growing ever closer to its bow where they store the actual warheads, when roughly 2 minutes later, a second and much larger explosion involving 5 to 7 actual warheads blows off the entire nose of the sub. Now, while the Kursk did have a total of 9 compartments, it is said that at this point, any crew members located within the first 6 had either passed away as a result of the secondary explosion or would have been completely submerged in water within less than a couple of minutes. And this is where things get even more disturbing. 23 of the initial 118-man crew were able to make their way to the 9th and final compartment, where they would then seal themselves off into darkness as the ship lost power and landed on the seafloor roughly 350 feet below. And while there was an escape hatch in this section, there was just simply no way anyone would have been able to make it to the surface. The events that followed are what made this one of the most controversial non-wartime military disasters of all time. During the initial rescue attempts, consistent banging could be heard coming from the hull of the ship. And while several attempts were made by Russian teams to rescue these men, they would all prove to be unsuccessful, as time and time again they would fail to latch onto the hatch. Another 5 days would go by while Putin would repeatedly decline assistance from multiple nations around the world that had placed specialized teams on standby to assist with the situation. Unfortunately, by the time he accepted help, it was all but too late. The banging had long since stopped and the men had all perished. It wasn't until roughly a year later, a Dutch recovery specialist would pull the sub to the surface for a hefty price tag of $44 million. And while there is much debate on exactly how long those men survived, some experts believe it could have been 24 to 36 hours. Lastly, it's worth pointing out, there are a couple of other theories as to how the initial explosion happened, but it is also worth noting there is much less evidence to support those theories. Regardless, I think we can all agree the Kursk 23 goes down as one of the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 16, The Byford Dolphin. rapid depressurization. Alright, so with everything going on about the OceanGate submersible and its catastrophic implosion, I'd like to remind you, we do have an equally horrifying and well-documented account of what occurs to the human body in the opposite situation. But before we get into the gritty details, there's some basic knowledge we should all understand before moving forward. Now, for the sake of keeping this video simple, essentially, the way this works is, the deeper you go, the more nitrogen within your body will begin to compress. In turn, your body begins to take on more nitrogen in an effort to fill this void. And rather than perform normal decompression stops at the end of every shift, they actually end up just going through one long acclimation period at the beginning and the end of their cycle, all the while living in a pressurized chamber for roughly 2 to 3 weeks at a time. Which leads us to November 5th of 1983. Two divers are working at depths of around 290 feet, or 9 atmospheres. Well, all of a sudden, a call comes in about inclement weather, and the two men are ordered to enter the dive bell and resurface immediately. Next thing you know, the bell is being hoisted out of the water with the crane, and the process of docking begins. The sequence goes as follows: exit the bell, closing the door behind you. Slightly increase pressure in diving bell to seal door tightly. Close chamber 1 door. Slowly depressurize trunk until it reaches a pressure of 1 atmosphere. And lastly, open the clamp to separate the bell from the chamber system. But what actually occurred would go down in history as one of the most disturbing and graphic incidents in the history of the profession. The two divers have just made their way out of the bell and are in the process of entering the main chamber, when all of a sudden, all 4 occupants are immediately ripped apart. Moreover, the individual closest to the bell had been sucked through a small hole that had opened as a result of this pressure change. Further investigation would find dive tender 1 had opened the clamp, separating the bell from the chamber before they could close the door behind them. Now think about this for a second. That was only a change in 8 atmospheres, and if we apply what we learned here to what has just happened in the OceanGate incident, those guys were at a depth of over 12,500 feet, or 400 atmospheres, which really puts it into perspective just how insane it is to travel to these depths, making the Byford Dolphin incident one of the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 17. The Paria Pipeline Disaster, one hell of a final ride. So back in February of 2022, 5 divers are performing work on a U-shaped pipeline just off the coast of Trinidad and Tobago. Now essentially, their task involved placing a riser, or extension, on the seaside vertical section of this pipe by way of hyperbaric chamber, which is basically a cap sitting on top of the pipe filled with air in order to give them a dry working environment. However, prior to starting work, they are told to remove one of possibly 2 inflatable plugs sitting just inside the pipe. What happened next is nothing short of horrifying. The very instant that plug is removed, the chamber fills with water as all 5 men are sucked 60 feet down, slamming directly into that 90-degree bend, all the while being pulled further and further from the chamber. What's more is, their equipment had been dragged along with them, so the entire time this is going on, they are just getting pummeled with random objects. Now after this huge vacuum effect has subsided, one of those divers, Chris Bodrum, was actually able to make his way back to the vertical section. But the water level inside that pipe just simply wasn't high enough for him to be able to pull himself back out into the chamber. And to make matters worse, for various reasons, another 3 hours would go by before 2 additional divers entered the chamber from above and were able to pull Chris out. And it was at this point, one of those 2 divers, Michael Kerbin, entered the pipe in an effort to find the other men. But unfortunately, he would run out of tether before he was able to do so. They then resurface and begin the process of making a longer cable, only to be met with orders to stand down from the Coast Guard as well as the company itself. Therefore, it is with an extremely heavy heart I must inform you, no further rescue efforts would be made. As a matter of fact, nearly 3 days would go by before they just opened another section of the line further down and proceeded to flush it until the remaining divers washed out. And ultimately what had happened was the pressure inside that pipe was much lower than that of the hyperbaric chamber. So when the plug was pulled out, that air had no choice but to flow down into that pipe while simultaneously pulling seawater up into the chamber. In addition to this, when throwing a camera down the pipe, they would determine a set of dive tanks had lodged itself in the pipeline, thus preventing the men from making it any further back towards that vertical section, placing the Paria pipeline tragedy among the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 18, Brett Morrow, cured in place. So back in November of 2017, the then 22-year-old had been repairing a 24-inch wide sewer line by way of cured in place piping, or CIPP, which for those of you who don't know is basically a cloth-like sleeve forced through a pipe via compressed air or, in some cases, water. A chemical within this material, known as styrene, will then begin to harden up, essentially becoming the new inside wall of said pipe. Well, as this material is making its way from one manhole to another, the process comes to a complete stop stop as it has become snagged on something roughly 30 feet inside. It was at this point, Brett climbed the 20 feet down into this manhole and began making his way towards the blockage. Before too long, he is now pushing and beating on the end of this thing in an effort to get it moving once again. However, unbeknownst to Brett, the material is now bunching up behind him as well, all the while becoming more and more solidified the more time he spends inside, effectively sealing him inside the pipe. Now, what's not made clear from any of the reporting about this incident is whether or not another individual had been inside that manhole watching Brett as this all went down. What we do know is that upon his discovery, they still had a slight visual on his boots and that they could still communicate with him, meaning he was still conscious and fully aware of the situation at hand. But unfortunately, the lining had solidified so quickly, they just simply didn't have any of the tools capable of cutting it out. Emergency services were then notified, and they would spend the next 4 hours relentlessly cutting away at this material, climbing back out of the pipe, pulling it out, climbing back in, so on and so forth. Well, at some point during this process, they lose communication with Brett, and he has stopped moving altogether. And unfortunately, by the time they were able to pull him out, he had long since passed away. Here's what went down. That compound, styrene, began pooling up and evaporating inside this pocket, and it was due to this and a lack of oxygen that would cause Brett to pass out and drown in a roughly 3-inch puddle that had formed in the bottom of the pipe. Benchmark Construction, the company at fault, would pay out roughly $55,000 in fines in accordance with a $3 million wrongful death lawsuit to the family of Brett Morrow, making this incident one of the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 19. The second largest massacre on humans by animals in history. So back in July of 1945, a ship known as the USS Indianapolis, along with its crew of 1,195 men, had just departed an island known as Tin Yan, which, for those of you who don't know, is in the Pacific Ocean. Well, it was from this point they were to group up with a fleet of naval vessels in order to run through some training exercises prior to heading to Okinawa. But unfortunately, they would never make it. Just after midnight, 2 days later, the ship is rocked by a torpedo from a Japanese sub while traveling through the Philippine Sea. Within the matter of about 12 minutes, the Indianapolis has completely rolled over, dipped below the surface, and began its descent roughly 13,000 feet into the abyss, taking 300 men with it. However, for the nearly 800 men left bobbing along the surface, their troubles had just begun. Their presence had attracted the attention of some of the ocean's most notorious and aggressive predators. And before too long, chaos absolutely erupts as screams can be heard throughout the entire night. And while these waters are in fact home to great whites and tiger sharks alike, it is widely believed the attack was mainly carried out by oceanic whitetips. Lesser feared in pop culture, but make no mistake, they will tear you the hell apart and are considered a very huge threat, particularly to anything near or along the surface. Well, a period of more than 4 days would go by where they would group up, taking turns at who had to be on the outer perimeter. Then finally, by complete mistake, a plane flying overhead spots them and initiates a rescue. And while hundreds of men most certainly had their lives taken by sharks, it is also very important to note many succumb to things like hypothermia, dehydration, starvation, and of course drowning. In addition to this, only 316 men would survive, making the sinking of the USS Indianapolis one of the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 20. Harley Dilly, all boxed in. So back in December of 2019, a then 14-year-old kid by the name of Harley Dilly had just gotten into an argument with his mother over the fact he did not want to go to school that day. Well, ultimately, this argument intensified to the point Harley stormed out of the house around 6 a.m. only to never be seen again. What's more is a period of 41 hours would go by before Harley was actually reported as being missing. It is said his parents assumed he had gone off to school and that he would be staying over at a friend's house until Sunday evening. But when he failed to show up, they called the police. Well, the very next day, a sizable search is launched in the town of Port Clinton. And it was at this point they began combing through absolutely anything and every place they could possibly think of. I mean, they are looking through dumpsters, manholes, abandoned houses, trash collection sites, and the woods. However, they were only able to find a few seconds of CCTV footage from the morning he went missing. Till finally, there came a call. Roughly 3 weeks later, on the night of January 14th, a couple had just came into town in order to spend a few nights in their summer home. However, upon walking into the house, they are hit with an overly pungent odor. They would then trace it to the chimney where Harley was found deceased in a standing position, crammed inside. Further investigation would find a flashlight along with a pair of socks at the base of the chimney. Next, Harley's glasses were found in one room, while his shirt and jacket were located in another. They had been sitting just below a set of vent holes that leads out of the chimney into each of those rooms. Now it's worth pointing out, a lot of people have a discrepancy with the fact his jacket is hanging on the door in this photo, to the point where authorities released a statement saying an officer had hung it up by mistake, thinking it was the homeowner's. It is theorized that on the day he went missing, Harley climbed up onto the roof and entered the chimney, feet first from above. However, similarly to the case of Joshua Maddox from episode 13, these things often narrow out the further you go down, meaning reality is absolutely horrifying. The fact his clothing was located outside of the chimney tells us his demise likely occurred over the course of a few hours, slipping further and further into the abyss until he just simply couldn't breathe anymore. Official cause of death, asphyxiation due to chest compression. Now, one of the craziest facts about this case is that they searched over 150 acres for this kid. Meanwhile, he was found less than an eighth of a mile away from his home, making this incident one of the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 21, Theric 25. Blasted with radiation. So back in March of 1986, a patient out of East Texas Cancer Center was in the process of receiving treatment for a tumor near his spine using the Theric 25 radiation therapy machine. Now essentially the way this worked was, the patient was to lay down on a stretcher-like table where the beam would then be focused on the area in question. In this case, the tumor near the gentleman's spine. It is at this point, the operator heads out to the control room, enters a few variables, and treatment can begin. At any rate, the guy laid down while the operator began punching in all the variables. But upon activating the beam, the machine displayed an error. This in turn paused treatment while simultaneously stating only a fraction of the required dose had been transmitted. The operator then dismissed the code and pressed P to resume treatment. But what she didn't know was that the patient began to feel heat, followed by an immense amount of pain in accordance with what sounded like eggs frying in the distance. It was in that very moment he tried like hell to get off that table while calling out for assistance. However, due to the fact the intercom system had been down, the operator was completely unaware of the situation, sending yet another beam directly into the left wrist of the patient. It is said the pain that followed led him to believe his entire hand had been removed. And here's the thing, despite the fact that there was a great deal of immediate redness and swelling in both of those locations, ultimately staff chalked it up as some sort of completely random anomaly, resulting in an electric shock. Little did they know, he had been hit with roughly 115 times the required dose, or between 16,000 and 25,000 rads in less than a second. This is where things get disturbing as hell. During the weeks that followed, he began to rapidly deteriorate, suffering extreme bouts of nausea in accordance with all the other symptoms of acute radiation poisoning. In addition to this, his left arm had become completely paralyzed in the process, but this was only the beginning of the horrifying fate that awaited. Over the course of the next few months, he lost complete functionality of his legs, mid-diaphragm, as well as his vocal cords. All the while, more and more equipment was needed to keep him alive. That is, until 5 months after the incident, when he finally passed away. Now it's worth pointing out, the medical center in question had treated over 500 patients with no incident up to this point. However, between the years of 1985 and 1987, a total of 6 incidents at 4 different locations would occur. But it is also worth noting, just 3 weeks later, a similar incident occurred at that same location with the very same operator, except this time, the beam was focused on the patient's head. Unfortunately, they would pass away as well. Further investigation would show that although AECL had been notified of these issues, overconfidence in the programming of the machine led to complete and utter dismissal and denial of the situations that had occurred, making the Theric 25 Texas incident one of the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 22. Eben Byers, radium on the regs. So back in 1927, there was this guy by the name of Eben who had been traveling home from a Yale football game when all of a sudden, the train came to a complete stop, throwing him from his bunk where he would sustain a minor arm injury among losing his mojo with the ladies. And although his doctor tried to convince him to just give it some time, Eben kept pushing the issue until eventually his doctor's like, look, I'm going to prescribe you to something called Radithor. It's essentially radium dissolved in water. You're going to take 1 tablespoon a day. And despite what we currently know about this element, whether it was by placebo effect, Eben made a full-blown turnaround. I mean, his energy had come back as well as his mojo with the ladies, and he had gained full functionality in that arm once again. So he not only continued to take it for the next 3 years, but he had also taken it upon himself to up his dosage to 3 full bottles a day. By 1930, he began to experience the hell that is being radiated from the inside out. I mean, his bones were quite literally disintegrating, as were his teeth, to the point where the slightest bit of contact and they would proceed to shift and or crack. Now keep in mind, at this time, radium was at the height of its popularity beauty and consumer products. It had been placed in everything from glassware to nail polish, medicines, and even watch dials. A great deal of you may know where this is going. Yes, this was around the same time the Radium Girls began to pass away. With that in mind, the Federal Trade Commission called on Eben to testify about his experience consuming radium. However, by that point, he had already developed several different cancers and became bedridden as a result. And one day, in 1931, his entire lower jaw fell completely off. Over the year that followed, Eben's story essentially became a testament to spreading awareness of a condition known as Ratathor jaw, which is essentially the deterioration of the bones within your mouth brought on by consuming radium. Roughly 1 year later, in March of 1932, Eben finally passed away as a result of all of those conditions. At any rate, the demise of Eben Byers officially went down among the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 23. The Cauldron of Doom. So back in May of 2009, there was a guy by the name of Marcus. He had been working at a soup factory located in Lübeck, Germany. And well, one evening he was given the task of cleaning these giant vats in which they produce their soup. So he makes his way up, enters the hatch, climbs back down into this giant 6-foot vat, and before you know it, he is scraping all the gunk that has built up along the sides. When all of a sudden, for one reason or another, the latch slams down, locking him inside the cauldron. And as he's standing there trying to pry his way out, it is very likely he would have heard the sound of a valve opening as piping hot steam along with boiling water begins blasting in all around him through these jets that are lining the walls of the vat. This is a process known as sanitization. Essentially, it is the last line of defense of ensuring each and every batch is contaminant-free. And before too long, the temperature in this giant industrial pot had reached well over 300 degrees, effectively sealing his fate in the process. Now, despite the fact there were other people in this factory when it happened, not a single person heard his cries for help. As a matter of fact, they didn't even notice there was a situation until they realized he was nowhere to be found hours later. And while there was never a definitive reason as to why the hatch had closed, further investigation would show there was absolutely nothing this guy could have done, as the process was set to occur automatically after the hatch had closed, making death by sanitization one of the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 24. John Jones. One hell of a claustrophobic nightmare. So leading up into 2009, there was this place you could go to known as the Nutty Putty Caves, located just outside of Salt Lake City, Utah. Its daring twists and turns have become quite popular with spelunkers on an international scale. But there was one passage in particular that continuously brought in cavers from all over the world. That being the infamous birth canal, a series of tight winding corkscrews. I mean, one minute you're going up, the next you're headed straight down and to the left until eventually there's this opening at the very end, and only then will you be able to turn around and head back out. Well, on November 24th of that same year, the then 26-year-old John, along with his brother Josh and a few friends, decided to give it a go. Now, while they had in fact been to this cave several times in the past, it had always been one of those things that just sort of sat in the back of their heads, kind of like a one day we will do this type of thing. Nevertheless, with John leading the group, they begin to make their way through an area known as the Big Slide. Essentially, this is a passage that leads to a much tighter area that then splits off into two directions, and ultimately, the decision they were about to make would have some extremely dire consequences. Just a short while later, John comes up to an extremely tight drop, and well, thinking this was the last push towards that opening, he proceeded to wiggle his way further and further down, all the while the walls are closing in all around him. And eventually, John has become completely pinned upside down in a completely unmapped area of this cave. It was in this very moment his brother Josh realized just how bad the situation was. With little to no way of gaining any leverage capable of pulling him up, the group made the decision to head back up and notify emergency services. Well, before too long, more than 200 search and rescue personnel have showed up and began the process of attempting to free John from this extremely tight space. What's worse is, upon further inspection, they notify John that it is very likely they will have to break his legs in order to get him out. With that in mind, they begin the process of drilling anchors into the wall of the cave in order to create a pulley system capable of lifting John. And at one point, there was a lot of hope as John begins to rise up while they're cranking on that system. However, this moment was short-lived as the anchors began shearing away from the wall, sending John careening straight back down even further into the cave than he already was. And while they continued their efforts to rescue him, there was just simply nothing more they could do. By the end of the ordeal, John had been suspended upside down for more than 24 hours, and unfortunately, 27 hours into the rescue, John's heart finally gave out due to the fact he had been wedged in that position for so long. In addition to this, John's body was never able to be retrieved, and the cave has since been sealed with John still inside. Going down in history as one of the most terrifying ways to go, episode 25, The Gears of Hell. So back in January of 2022, a couple of guys working for a company known as Higby Salva LP had been conducting maintenance on an escalator. Now essentially the pair had split up, with employee number 1 installing running lights down below, while the other was working up top in an area known as the pit. This is a small confined space that not only allows access to be able to lube up the system, but it also contains the drive unit, or, for lack of better words, the mechanism that powers the escalator, sending it in rotation. Now it's important to note, there was little to no communication between the pair up to this point, and at around 9:52 a.m., employee number 1 energizes the system while employee number 2 is still inside the pit. Employee number 2 was then caught between the gears and the step chain, which in turn began dragging him towards a much smaller, tighter space, all the while becoming more and more compressed the deeper it pulls him in. And although employee 1 tried to hit the emergency stop, it was just simply too late and there was nothing they could do. Official cause of death: blunt force trauma. Further investigation would show Higby Salva LP, the company at fault, did not have a permit to enter that confined space, nor had they been using lockout-tagout procedures, and as a result, they were slapped with about $32,000 in fines. In addition to this, Higby Salva LP dissolved roughly 1 year later. Going down is one of the most terrifying ways to go, episode 26, Fatal Flavors, the unintended elixir of doom. So back in August of 2006, a couple of metal workers out of Glenwood Springs had been tasked with aging a metal staircase at a client's home in what is essentially the middle of nowhere, Colorado. Well, at some point, one of those two men, 54-year-old Frank Gabassi, walked over to the work truck in order to grab his blue Gatorade, which he had packed for lunch prior to showing up. So he opens the bottle, turns it up, and begins throwing it back. But after a few sizable gulps, Frank spews out what's left in his mouth as he realizes he has just made a terrible mistake. You see, they had been using a product known as antique black, which is essentially an artificial way to make metals seem as though they are much older than they actually are. However, it's important to note, this product contains concentrated amounts of a highly corrosive light blue substance known as selenious acid. The list of hazards are as follows: corrosive to the eye, skin, and respiratory tract, may cause irritation of the nose, throat, and lungs, may cause coughing, wheezing, and or shortness of breath. So it's not necessarily something you would want to mishandle. That being said, what Frank did not know is that a used bottle of Gatorade had been filled with that substance in order to be transported to the job site. What's more is, the bottle had been sitting directly next to his cooler in the back of the truck. And to make matters even worse, they were 30 to 40 minutes away from the nearest emergency room. Over the course of the next few hours, Frank began to slip in and out of consciousness as he started experiencing respiratory depression. In other words, his lungs were failing to exchange carbon dioxide for oxygen. And roughly 48 hours into treatment, Frank unfortunately ended up passing away. And here's the thing, further investigation by OSHA would find this was a fairly common practice for this company. As a matter of fact, just 2 days after Frank's death, the spouse of another employee for that same company was poisoned in a similar incident. While OSHA would cite them for the improper storage of the chemical as well as failing to communicate the hazard, it is also very important to note those fines totaled less than $15,000 combined. Truly among the most unfortunate and terrifying ways to go, episode 27, Lily Hernandez. Tragic in every way. So back in December of last year, a then 29-year-old Lily Hernandez had just recently started a job through a temporary staffing agency. And well, her job through that agency entailed working in this rather large pizza factory located in Gurnee, Illinois. Among her list of duties was the late-night cleaning of various pieces of equipment. That being said, in the early morning hours of December 22nd, Lily was tasked with cleaning what is referred to as a spiral cooler. Now essentially the way this works is, pizza enters the machine via conveyor belt on the bottom. It is then frozen as it continues to pass up through the system, going round and round at a very slow speed. Nevertheless, she was left unattended with minimal training and told to clean the machine. And at around 1 a.m., Lily gets down on the ground and proceeds to crawl under the cooler while it's still in motion. But just as her head began to enter that space, Lily was caught by the belt, which began slowly pulling her closer and closer towards one of the outside legs, giving her ample time to realize just what was about to happen. And before too long, Lily quite literally lost her head in what can only be described as a Final Destination style incident. Maricapo Pizza, the company at fault, was handed a total of 29 citations in accordance with $2.8 million in fines. But it's also worth pointing out, as of June this year, they have contested or disputed each and every one of them, placing death by spiral cooler among the most